Welcome to Tell Your Story Alaska. Real Alaskans, real stories. I'm your host, Billy Turnland, and here is your story.
Welcome back to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. In the last episode, we talked about the 10 coolest facts about Alaska. And to make that episode, I had a lot more than 10, but I had to cut a lot of them out. And it was a bit painful to cut out, but I wanted to keep it to 10. Anyway, I just decided to do 10 more coolest facts about Alaska. And I hope this just continues to kind of whet your appetite for all things Alaska. If you're listening and you have an interest in Alaska, this is a good episode for you to just kind of sit back and enjoy to just some really interesting facts. Some are stories about Alaska today. So here's 10 more coolest things about Alaska. Let's dive right in. Number 10. The last frontier has been home to Native Americans for many generations. The Native Alaskans still identify with their original tribes, including the Inuits, the Tlingits, the Haidas, the Aleuts, the Athabascans, and the Yupik, and there are some others. They live in about 220 villages across the state. The population of Alaska, as of 2020, is 736,081, and 15% of the population are considered to be Alaska Native. Now, that's the largest percentage of any state in the nation for the ratio of Native to non-Native people. So Anchorage has a relatively high population of Native Alaskans. About over 50% of the population lives between the Mat-Su Valley and Anchorage, which is about 400,000 people. So if you can do a little math, that's over 50% of the population of the state lives in this one small area, which means the rest of the state is pretty sparsely populated. And they're spread out between those 220 villages and a couple other cities like Juneau and Sitka or Ketchikan and places like that. Okay, number 9. Alaska is home to some of the most abundant natural resources, and this dominates the Alaskan economy. This includes mined minerals like coal, rock, sand, gravel, and gold. Even gold today, I can still fly over gold mines. They're pretty fun to see. And of course, you've seen those, gold shows. Those are, there's still quite a bit of gold mining going on. There's timber, natural gas, but the most prominent natural resource is oil. And oil is found mainly in northern Alaska. It's estimated that there's 25 billion barrels of oil, and it makes up 80% of the state's economy, which is an incredible amount. The oil discovery up in northern Alaska is more than twice the size of the next largest oil field in the country, which is in Texas. There's one area up there which is kind of a political football. It's called ANWR, which stands for Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Today, this is a constant political battle between those who want to preserve the animal habitats up there versus the economic benefit of drilling. For example, under Trump, the drilling was open and it was happening, but as soon as Biden was elected, one of the first things he did was to shut down ANWR. He shut down drilling up there. So it seems like the drilling is like a light switch. It's like on and off, depending on the political swing of that particular day. And that's just how it is. Okay, number 8. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. If you haven't noticed, there's going to be a lot about oil. If you live in Alaska, there's a huge number of people. We call it work in the oil fields, or we call them slopers. They work the slopes, which means they go up north and they work in the oil industry. Anyway, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System is a massive 800-mile, 48 inches in diameter pipeline, which starts in Prudhoe Bay and ends in Valdez. This construction of this was prompted by the oil discovery up there in 1968. And this has led to some pretty intense debate because there was environmental issues. It affected the habitats and migrations of certain animals. And then the native people themselves said, hey, you can't just build on our land like this willy-nilly. And so they started to speak up. So this intense debate over these issues were between 1969 and 1975. However, the pipeline was still completed in 1977. Tens of thousands of workers, they went up north to Alaska for the very high wages and free housing, but it was also very long hours. People who worked there made really good money, and it drew tens of thousands of workers. As of 2015, the pipeline has delivered 17 billion gallons of crude oil, with a max capacity of 2 million barrels a day. Although it does not deliver that much anymore, they've really reduced that. This oil discovery in 1968 and the construction of this pipeline prompted a big debate over the use of native lands because we were extracting oil out of the land and the natives wanted claim that this is their land. It became a debate. So this led to a deal signed by President Nixon in 1971 called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which offered $1 billion for the use of the land, and a large portion of the state was preserved for what's called the Native Corporation. The Native Corporation has been split up into 12 areas in the state, and this basically is a way for these corporations to engage in, and the terminology they use is corporate capitalism. And they make a lot of money from the abundant natural resources in the state. And the profits from this serves the 220 plus villages in Alaska, so the Native Alaska people. There's like profit sharing with each Alaska Native individual that happens. This was an effort to preserve Native culture and still allow them to engage in modern capitalistic America. This was largely praised by the Native Alaskans, but of course there still was some criticism, yet for the most part, this was widely accepted by the Native Alaskans. All right, number 7. Alaska is home to the second largest oil spill disaster in the United States. This happened at Prince William Sound, and it's known as the Exxon Valdez oil spill on March 24th, 1989. An oil tanker struck a reef, spilling 10.8 million gallons of crude oil into the bay. An estimated 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 22 orcas, an unknown number of fish perished in the disaster. Toxins can still be detected in the water today. And as you can imagine, the disaster has led to some pretty intense debates about environmental concerns and the oil industry. Okay, I promised that was the last one about oil. But given that it's Alaska, 80% of the state's economy, there's quite a bit of oil stuff. I'm pretty sure it's the second largest oil spill disaster in the United States, but the number one was the Deepwater Horizon, which there was a movie about. I think that was in the Gulf of Mexico, but I could be wrong. I didn't look that up. But there's a movie about it with Mark Wahlberg, but I actually haven't seen it. So anyway, I don't know if there's movies about this oil spill, but there's definitely some documentaries on YouTube. All right, the most common trees. This is number 6. We're on number 6. The most common trees are birch, cedar, and Sitka and black spruce. But this is really what number 6 is about. It's about beetle kill. If you live in Alaska, you know what beetle kill is. We talk about it all the time because it's everywhere. There's this particular type of beetle. It's called the spruce beetle because it mainly affects spruce pine trees. And they get under the bark and they eat it and it kills the tree. And this is like a pandemic across the state. You know, when I hop in my plane, specifically in the Matsu Valley, it's just a sea of dead spruce trees. It's really tragic to see because endless dead trees as you're flying over. And so we call it the beetle kill. In fact, every year, you know, I heat my house with firewood, and so I collect firewood every fall. and I'll get call from friends and stuff. Hey, I knocked down a couple more beetle kills. And so I'll go over there with my chainsaw and get it. So the silver lining about beetle kill is that you can still use it for firewood, and you can even mill it and still use it for lumber, because it seems like the beetles do not go in and kill the wood. They kill the tree, but the wood can still be used as long as it's not been staying in there too long. So it still makes it useful, but we'd rather have the trees because it's really devastating seeing dead trees, a sea of dead trees when you're flying over. Okay, number five. Number 5 is the lakes in Alaska. There are a lot of lakes in Alaska. Now, I'm originally from Illinois, and I used to go up to Minnesota to go camping in the Boundary Waters. I also have family in Minnesota, and they're still there. So Minnesota has a special place in my heart, and Minnesota boasts of being the land of 10,000 lakes. Now, it does have more than 10,000 lakes. I did look this up once, but, their tagline is land of 10,000 lakes. There's a lot of lakes there. So even if 10,000 is the number, it's a lot. It has no comparison to Alaska, because Alaska is home to 3 million lakes. And of course, that's an estimate, but 3 million lakes. Alaska also has more coastline than any other state in the nation. So if you compare it to California and all those, you might think those have a lot of coastline, but Alaska just beats them by far. And the one thing that I really like about the number of lakes in Alaska is that I have a float plane. I fly a Maule M5, and I can put floats on it. And float flying is probably my favorite. I just like landing on the water. As I fly across the land, there's just runways everywhere, and you can just ditch into a lake somewhere, throw in your pole, and just see what's there. And I really enjoy doing that. And I think we'll probably do a podcast about that sometime, just because it's like my favorite thing to do. And there's so many lakes. You never know if you're landing on a lake. No one's been, probably not, but probably someone's been there. But that's a lot of lakes, though. All right. Number 4. Number 4 is going to be a longer one because it's a very prominent part of Alaska and its culture. So I want to spend a little time on it, but it has to do with the dog mushers. I am not a dog musher. I have seen the dog mushers, the dog sled guys. I don't know a lot about it, so you cannot turn to me as an expert on this by far. However, the dog mushing is a huge part of the culture, and there are several races across the state that involve dog sled teams. The one thing that's a connection to me, I guess, is I think there's a Disney movie called Iron Will that I saw when I was a kid. It's like from the early 90s, I think, or maybe even the 80s, I'm not sure. But I remember loving that movie and be kind of fascinated by it. And then there's been more recent films. There's like a cartoon called Balto, and then there's a newer one called Togo, which was really, really good. And so for me, that's kind of my only connection to dog mushers. But I do live in a community where some of the best dog mushers in the state live. And so I'll often see dog sled teams training, and they'll be on, ATVs, like four-wheelers, with their dogs pulling the four-wheeler. And this is, in the summertime, and they're training. So anyway, dog mushing. The most famous race is the Iditarod race. It's known as the last great race on Earth. Every March, the dog mushers line up for the nearly 1,000-mile race, starting in Anchorage, and it ends in Nome. Now, the history of this was interesting to me. I thought that this race went all the way back to the early 1900s, but it doesn't. It was established in 1973 by a famous Alaskan named Joe Reddington, who was a dog musher. And Joe noticed that dog mushers were kind of being taken over by snow machines, which they call iron dogs. And these snow machines had proven to be less reliable than the dogs because the snow machines break down, can leave people stranded out in the wilderness, but dogs tend to not break down. They're much more reliable. Anyway, Joe saw a need to preserve the dog musher tradition, and this led him to establish the National Historic Trail, which is now the Iditarod Trail. The trail begins in Willow, Alaska, and ends in Nome. The trail has changed a little bit over the years, but it's been largely the same. It's just under 1,000 miles long, and it crosses 2 mountain ranges and a lot of flat tundra. The racers use 12 to 16 dogs, which are carefully cared for with good nutrition, and they also train them really hard. There has been some animal cruelty voices speaking up, but they don't seem to be getting very far because, I've seen these dogs and they seem to absolutely love what they do. There have been some deaths of the animals, but still, if you die doing something you love, I don't know that the animal cruelty folks will get very far because the dogs seem to just love doing this. In the early days, the mushers would take about 20 days to complete the race, but now they can do it in as few as 10 days. The current record holder for the fastest completion of the race was by Dallas Seavey, which was in 2021, with a time of 7 days, 14 hours, 8 minutes, and 57 seconds. In the dog musher world, someone would probably hear that and say, that's incredibly fast. And I didn't know that was fast, so I did some math. I just took 1,000 and divided the number of days, and it's about 130 miles a day, approximately. That if you can imagine a dog running 130 miles per day for 7 or 8 days, that's amazing. And these dogs are really well cared for, is what I read, and they are carefully trained, and they can accomplish this. These dogs are awesome. Okay, the Iditarod Trail was established when gold was discovered in Nome in 1898 and 1899, and the population of Nome boomed to about 10,000 people. Most of the trail had already been made by Native Alaskans in the ancient past, but it was officially cleared out in 1908 by the government. It became one of the routes for supplying miners and settlers with delivering mail, and the mushers would also haul out gold that were found by the miners. The Iditarod is often associated with the famous Serum Run in 1925, but there's actually a separate race to commemorate the Serum Run, and the route is different. And I'm going to talk about the Serum Run in a minute because it's a really neat story and there's some movies about it. But first, I want to talk about the Iron Dog. The Iron Dog has to do with the dog musher community because an Iron Dog is a snowmobile. I have a snowmobile. I really like driving it, but I'm still kind of getting better at it. Anyway, the Iron Dog is kind of like the snowmobile race. If you're going to do the ultimate snowmobile race, this is it. It started in 1984, and it's similar route to the Iditarod, except the only difference is it's done with snowmobiles. It follows basically the Iditarod Trail, but every year they change the route a little bit. This year, in 2023, it's going to start in Big Lake, Alaska, which is really close to my home, and it traverses over the Alaska Range to the Yukon River, and then to the Bering Sea coast to Kotzebue, and then it returns to Big Lake. The website says it's the world's longest, toughest snowmobile race, and it boasts of being over 2,500 miles long. There's also an expedition class race that follows the original northern route of the Iditarod to Nome, and that's just 1,049 miles. And it's same with the dog mushers of the Iditarod. They actually put GPS devices on the snow machines, and also with the Iditarod racers, they put GPSs on them, so you can go online and follow the racers. My brother does that every year, and I haven't done that. I probably should. It'd be really neat to follow them. What I'd love to do is to hop in my airplane and follow the racers in my plane. I know they hire people to do that, but I would enjoy that. It'd be really fun. Okay, there's one other race called the Yukon Quest. The Yukon Quest is a 1,000-mile race from Fairbanks to Whitehorse. It follows the Yukon River, and Whitehorse, by the way, is in the Yukon in Canada. The race is known for having very long stretches without any checkpoints, a place you can rest and sleep. So in that sense, it's sort of you can say it's the more dangerous race because it has longer stretches without any checkpoints. But I don't know very much about the Yukon Quest. On the website, it looked like they only had 4 racers, and so it's less popular, but it does seem pretty intense. Okay, the last thing about dog mushers I want to talk about is the Serum Run. This is a famous story in Alaska history, so it's worth taking a few minutes to summarize it. In December of 1924, the population of Nome was about 10,000, and it only had one doctor, a guy named Dr. Welch, and he had 4 nurses helping him. And in the town of Nome, a respiratory disease called diphtheria broke out, and it affected mainly children. After 2 children had died under Dr. Welch's care, he went to the town and said, we absolutely need these serums, these like vaccines against this disease. He tried giving a couple of these young patients an expired vaccine, but it was ineffective. So he realized he needed some new vaccines. So the problem was it was the dead of winter, very, very cold out, and so the town had a meeting, and after some discussion, it was decided that flying the vaccines in by bush plane was not possible. Back then, the bush planes, in 1925, the engines were water-cooled, and flying when it's like -30 or colder is extremely dangerous, and so that was ruled out as an option. So they chose that dog sled teams were the best choice. So the original plan was to have 2 teams do the job, one departing from Nome heading east, and the other heading from Nenana heading west with the serum. Now, the one from Nenana got the serum because there's a train line from Anchorage to Nenana. I've seen this train line. The train still runs today. But the serum started from Anchorage and was taken by train to Nenana, where it was given to the dog sled team. So from the plan was for the 2 to meet in a village about halfway between the village of Nulato. I have a friend that lives in Nulato now, and I haven't been there, but I would really like to visit Nulato sometime soon. Maybe I will this year. But the plan was to have the vaccine or the serum to be passed from one dog musher to the next in Nulato. A man named Leonard Seppala was chosen to do this task, and he was in Nome. So he began training his 20 dog sled team, led by a 12-year-old dog named Togo. Now, 12-year-old dog is considered to be old for a dog, especially to do such a journey. But Togo was a very special dog and very capable dog. So Seppala was chosen. The weather at the time had gotten so bad that in the end they decided to do much more than 2 dog sled teams, and they ended up doing many dog sled teams that passed this serum from one to the next. They did an average of 30 or 40 miles per team, to which the serum was passed to another dog sled team that was fresh and ready to go. Still, Leonard Seppala and his dog Togo did the longest stretch of any of the other teams. He did 264 miles, which is much, much more than even the next most team. And the dog Togo, being as old as he was, is really an amazing accomplishment. And in one day, they did 84 miles in a single day, which at the time is an incredible feat. The very last leg was done by a man named Casson, and his team was led by a dog named Balto. During his last run, his was a bit harrowing. He reached incredible winds and also extremely cold temperatures. And the winds got so bad at one point, Casson's sled tipped over and the serum fell out into some deep snow. And he was desperately trying to find the serum, which fell into the snow. He ended up taking his gloves off, digging into the snow. He found the serum, but his hands were frostbitten. And so he was injured in that way. But regardless, it was Casson, led by Balto. They're the ones who rolled into town in Nome with the serum, and Balto became kind of the hero dog that made the frontline newspapers, which at the time, as the story was happening, the newspapers were like following it, and it was like this hit sensation of a story, and Balto became the famous dog. Even though it was Togo who did not the majority of the work because it was shared, but the longest run. At the time when the serum arrived, there were 28 kids sick under Dr. Welch's care, and they had brought enough serum for 30 kids. So it was really like you could say providential. So I love that story. If you ever get a chance to watch Togo, that's probably my favorite movie. Just really well done and a fun story about Alaska's history. Okay. That was enough on dog mushers. That was number 4. Now, number three. Alaska's commercial fishing industry is impressively huge. It produces 58,700 jobs, 5.7 million pounds of seafood worth about $2 billion, which ends up being about 4.7 billion of product value. Fishermen from all over the country. I think I read that there are fishermen from every state in the United States that come to Alaska every year. I know a couple people in this fishing industry. I don't know a lot about it. I would love to learn more. Man, I would love to be out on one of those fishing boats, you know. I have a small boat and I have a float plane, so I'm able to do some simple fishing. You know, I catch trout and northern pike. Sometimes I catch salmon. But this would be quite the experience that I'd love to take part in. I do know some people. Maybe I'll have a chance. But the fishing industry is just huge. Billions of dollars involved. And you've probably seen those TV shows about I forget what they're called, about these fishermen that, you know, how dangerous it is. So that's up in Alaska too. Very prominent in Alaska. All right, number two. In 1897, a newspaper article announced the discovery of gold along the Klondike River. And this created like just this splurge of people running up to Alaska. About 100,000 young men and women with nothing to lose. They were rushing up there to gain their riches. And this happened between 1897 and 1899. Most of them found their way to Skagway, Alaska, where they had to do a harrowing journey in order to find their gold. And the reason it was harrowing was because from Skagway, you had to hop over this mountain range to get to the Klondike River. And from the Klondike River, they would build a canoe with local materials there, and then they can make their way, you know, up the river. And most of them made their way to Dawson City, and Dawson City itself kind of boomed in population, and there's a lot more capitalism, production going on. It just really boomed at the time. Anyway, the interesting part of this thing in Skagway, where most of the gold seekers went, they began their journey there. If you've watched some movies, there's that image of people like with big packs on their back, kind of like slowly making their way up this mountain. There's some movies that portray this. The reason they have to carry all that stuff is because at the time Canada set out a law that said they had to carry 1,000 pounds of supply or they were not allowed into that country. And they did that to prevent having their Canadian government have to send out these like rescue missions to save people. They wanted people to be provided for when they went out there. And so they required 1,000 pounds of supply, but this was challenging because the route to get from Skagway over to the Klondike was pretty harrowing. And that's why people would do multiple trips. I think it was about 32 miles up a mountain and then down the other side, and you had to bring 1,000 pounds. So people did multiple trips back and forth. Now, on that steep cliff, you know, that steep trail that you see portrayed in some of the movies, there were some avalanches that killed something like 50 or 60 people. I think there's a graveyard over there where those people have been buried. This gold rush was the source of several movies today. Like if you've seen the Call of the Wild movie with Harrison Ford, they portray this, and it's really I just really enjoy that time of history, and there's some documentaries about this that are really worth watching. Okay, so Dawson City quickly became like a thriving town, but in the end, not many of the gold seekers found the riches they were looking for. Some did, but all of them got an experience of their lifetime. But this event also boosted the population in Alaska, which led to Alaska becoming a U.S. territory in 1912. And that's when some local governance began to be over Alaska. All right, number one. This one is very interesting, so I left it for number one because I'm most fascinated by it. But it is that World War II did come to Alaska. In fact, the Japanese took over some parts of Alaska, and this has become known as the Forgotten War. After the Pearl Harbor attack, which we all know about, that happened in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, the United States responded to the Pearl Harbor attack with the infamous Doolittle Raid, which happened on April 18th, 1942. This is a really amazing story. It's if you ever have a chance to watch a documentary or read a book, it is portrayed in a few movies, but I highly recommend you enjoy this story because it's amazing. But I'll tell it briefly. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bomber raid, and the plan was to have these bombers take off from an aircraft carrier, which was unheard of. It was not thought that this was possible. These are big planes. Aircraft carriers have small runways. But Doolittle was able to lighten the planes enough, and he made it possible for these planes to take off an aircraft carrier. This allowed the aircraft carrier to sail from Hawaii towards the Japanese mainland, and when they were close enough, there's much more to this story, but when they were close enough, they took off from the aircraft carrier, they flew over Tokyo, bombed Tokyo successfully, and then they all ended up crash landing in China. Now, there's a whole harrowing story of what happened to each of the 80 people that were involved with this. Some of them ended up in prison camps, some made it back pretty quickly, but there's a lot of different stories. I think 3 of them died. This attack changed the war. Not because of damage, they really didn't do very much damage, but it was a psychological damage to the Japanese people and a morale booster for the U.S. military. The Japanese had no idea that their homeland was vulnerable to such an attack. So even though there wasn't very much damage, it led the Japanese to make decisions that led to their defeat. Many argue. Now, this is sort of debated. What was going through the minds of the Japanese military leaders at the time? We're not really sure. There's some idea, and a lot of authors do some speculating. So I'll try to diagnose it a little bit. The Japanese didn't know where this Doolittle attack came from. They did not suspect that these bombers could have taken off from an aircraft carrier, which they did. The Japanese also they had their sights mainly set on the Midway Island. Midway Island was a very strategic location for seizing control of the Pacific Ocean. They also wanted to control the northern route, which would have been Alaska. But one of the theories is that the Japanese were suspect that Doolittle completed his raid from Alaska, or if they didn't think it came from there, then they realized that the U.S. could launch attacks on the Japanese mainland from Alaska because it's the closest land to Japan. So the main thing what they wanted to do in attacking Alaska was to draw U.S. naval forces away from Midway to help defend Alaska, and so that they can more easily take Midway. Whatever the reasons were, on June 3rd, 1942, the Japanese attacked Alaska, starting at Dutch Harbor. They weren't able to do very much damage at Dutch Harbor, but in the end, the Japanese did end up taking over the islands of Attu and Kiska, and this led to a lot of conflict on those islands, but it was a year-long conflict, which in the end, the Japanese abandoned the islands. This is now known as the Forgotten War. However, one of the results of this was a huge advancement in military presence in Alaska at the time. Several bases were built, many of them inland, and I read that they'd put them inland so that they could be protected from attack. So those military bases led to more roads in Alaska, and there's whole stories there with how they built these things and the winter and the conditions. But what happened was Alaska now had some infrastructure with roads and these military bases and more population. So this put Alaska on a path to statehood, which happened on January 3rd, 1959. Alaska was voted in as a state. And I think largely because of this, the Japanese attacking Alaska. And so I think that's a neat connection. So I will end here because everything I read about this Forgotten War, it makes a connection to a man named Billy Mitchell. And they all find it important to quote him, something that he said to Congress back in 1935. But before I tell you what he said, Billy Mitchell was a French-born U.S. Air Force officer, and he commanded all air combat units in France during World War I. He became recognized as one of the top airmen of the war, along with some other aces, and he was the most famous American in Europe at the time. From what I read, he was a very unique figure, very outspoken, And after World War I in 1935, he went to Congress and said, "I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. I think it is the most important strategic place in the world." And of course, that being spoken in 1935, it does seem like what he said was prophetic because of the attacks on Alaska by Japan not long after that. And now the way the world is going, who knows? Alaska may still be that place, the most important strategic place in the world. All right, so that is your part 2 of top 10 coolest facts about Alaska. So I suppose that makes 20. We have 20 cool facts. And of course, there's much more. So I hope that whets your appetite for Alaska. And as you know, if you've listened to the first episode, what I want to do in this podcast is tell gospel-related stories in Alaska. This is all from the perspective of a missionary bush pilot. So if you have a gospel-related story in Alaska, or if you have a story that's unique to Alaska, maybe you have a wilderness survival story, something kind of more fun and interesting, I'm interested in telling those as well. If you have a historical or cultural insight, I would like to get in touch with you. So if you want to contact me to tell me your story, or for any other reason, you can contact me at tysalaska@gmail.com. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. This is Tell Your Story, Alaska.
If you have a story that you want told or you just want to reach out to me for any reason, please contact me at tysalaska@gmail.com. tysalaska@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you.